Dear students and dear online participants, welcome again to our lecture series on strengthening EU environmental law. Today, Professor Stefan Weishaar will be presenting, and he will do so online. He's already here on the big screen in the Statenzaal. Professor Weishaar is an alumni from Maastricht University, and he also defended his PhD at this university. And it was my great pleasure to be involved as supervisor in his research project. However, Stefan moved from the most southern university of the Netherlands, here in Maastricht, to the most northern university, namely to Groningen University, where he is now professor of law and economics. Stefan develops research around the working of markets and regulatory instruments, with special interest into emission trading schemes, plural, because the linking of emission trading schemes is also one of his favorite topics. Today, he will discuss an innovative regulatory instrument of the European Union that is related to the EU emissions trading scheme, namely the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. And it was this morning during breakfast that I saw that the headline of the Dutch financial newspaper stated that CBAM will help the Dutch industries. However, the subtitle of Stefan's lecture questions whether CBAM will help to green industries in third countries outside the European Union. Well, all in all, this shows how actual and important the topic of CBAM is. And therefore, it is my great pleasure, Stefan, to hand over the word to you.
Thank you so much, Marianne, for your kind introductory words and for inviting me back to Maastricht. It would have been marvelous to be there in person, but unfortunately, in light of climate change, trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we decided to try to do it online, and I hope it also works. I always love to be back in Maastricht, and particularly to discuss naughty things, nerdy things like emissions trading and the CBAM is always something that I love doing. Without further ado, and in light of the strict time procedure that we have for this setting, I would like to briefly elaborate on my topic. I'm going to address you today on CBAM, encouraging cleaner industries across the world. What I would like to go through with you today is a brief but intense agenda. First, I would like to set the scene because I was told that it would be good to have a good grounding and a bigger framework of why we need to address and discuss the issues that we are addressing. So why do we have this carbon border adjustment mechanism in the European Union? I will briefly elaborate on some of the design features of this new and innovative instrument. We will then take a moment to look at various impacts on different nation states, and we will subsequently take a brief look at possible responses, and also responses that I think will be found by many trading partners of the European Union. And then indeed, it might be questionable how effective the overall CBAM system will be. And it will also be a question whether it is indeed only an environmental measure or whether in the long run it will show its true colors, and whether policymakers would want to give it a more protectionist view. Because in the design, how it is designed to operate today, it is very clearly exclusively an environmental policy measure. Good, ladies and gentlemen, if I may already take you to the first part of this lecture, I would like to address you on the CBAM. What does it do? Why do we call it in the Netherlands the kabam? Basically because it hits like a bombshell. and that is indeed needed, something to shake the European industry, the European approach to climate change, and to make sure that we are engaging proactively with emissions. And for this, it is important to take you first on a journey through climate change. Well, basically, the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmospheres are rising. Here we see a graph over the last couple of decades, and as you might discern, it is upward sloping. And it is not only upward sloping, but the growth rates are rising. So basically, we are not only heading in the wrong direction, but things are getting worse in a hurry and ever more quickly. Of course, a few years back, we had COVID, which led to a reduction in economic activity, and the hopes that some of us might have been harboring that there would be clearly positive effects on climate change. Well, if we look at this graph here, we see that the emissions were not really positively impacted by COVID, at least not to a degree that we can really see here in this graph. So basically, things are not improving. What we also see here in this graph is cumulative emissions from different countries, different parts or regions around the globe. And the area in beige, lightish brown, stands for the European Union. The European Union, when it really commenced its drive towards climate change in the 1990s, reflecting on what it should do to improve the greenhouse gas emissions, global warming, was responsible for around 70% of the global emissions. By now, in 2022, it's only accounting for 7.4%. So basically, the European Union, albeit still an important player in the climate change debate, will not solve the problem by itself. Everybody in the globe needs to take its responsibility and try to reduce emissions, because we cannot do it alone. That is very clear. What this graph also indicates is that the European Union, the EU27, has been successful in actively reducing greenhouse gas emissions by more than 26%, or from 1990s by above minus 28%. So we see that things are positively developing in the European Union. But when we look at where we are today, where global warming is heading, we need to engage in a severe reality check, and I'm afraid that is quite sobering, or in other words, extremely scary. Here, just a few snippets that will tell you where we are. Basically, we wanted with the Paris Agreement to limit greenhouse gas emissions to 1.5%, or if that would not be possible, to 2% at the maximum. We are, however, at a trajectory of reaching 2.5 to 2.9%. In order to make the Paris goal achievable, we would need to increase our efforts somewhere between 28 and 42%. So we would need to do significantly more by 2030 already than what we have been envisaging to do, what countries have been committing to do. Perhaps even worse, an insight from the OECD is that tipping points at current temperature increases of around 1.3 degrees centigrade are already possible and increasingly likely as global warming continues. Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, has been describing the current situation very concisely, but in a cunning and illustrative way. He says that we are on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. And I think that summarizes the situation where we are today very nicely. Let us take a brief look at what we are doing in the European Union, because we are very busy. It's way up on the policy agenda. And here you see that the European Union policymakers have been introducing ever more stringent, ever more ambitious climate goals in rapid transition. So for the Kyoto Protocol, -8%, 2007, we had the 2020 goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 20%. Then in 2014, -40%, 23. And now for 2030, we want to have -55%. And actually, if possible, even more, because for 2040, we are considering now to move to -40%. And of course, we would like to have net zero by 2050 and be the first continent that is climate neutral. So we have very strong ambitions. And if we were to implement them successfully, it would mean that our greenhouse gas emissions from different sectors would look somewhat like this. So many areas that now are accounting for substantial parts of emissions would basically need to curb their emissions completely. Like, the task ahead of us is mind-boggling, to say the very least. How do we try to achieve this? Well, the centerpiece, the flagship of the European climate policy is the European emissions trading system that was introduced in 2005, started its operations in this year. It covers around 40% of greenhouse gases from the European Union. It covers large industrial operators and electricity generators, and has also support instruments for energy intensive and trade exposed industries, so-called IT industries. That is what is happening at European level. We have other pricing mechanisms at national level, for example, carbon tax schemes. We also have other flanking instruments that have an impact on climate as well, if you think of the Energy Tax Directive, for example. But still, an integral part of the climate change policy is this emission trading system that we have. Moreover, we have the Green Deal that we introduced in 2019. It became a legislative proposal in 2021. It consists of several legislative initiatives, and one of them is the CBAM legislation. And part of this carbon border adjustment mechanism is that we would like industry to do much more than what has been done in the past. And that is very important because at the moment, industry is getting allowances for free. And that is understandable because whenever you are introducing a carbon price, you're making production more expensive because you put a price on emissions and you ask entrepreneurs, businesses, industry to internalize these costs and hence reduce emissions. This effect on productivity, this effect on production cost in particular, is something that they would like to pass on to consumers, rendering their own products more expensive and less competitive. And this is very tricky, and it has always been the linchpin of policy discussions, because on one side, we of course would like to advance climate change, but it's not that we want to stop production. We want to continue to have a competitive industry. And to find the right balance between the two is not easy. So if you look at the European climate legislation, we do see that there have always been support strategies to help industry to become cleaner while staying competitive. various support schemes. We even have some countries being allowed to offer state aid for indirect emissions from rising electricity or energy costs, for example. We also have to note, unfortunately, that there have been prolonged times when allowance prices were depleted, were reasonably low. Here we have periods where a ton of CO2 was around €3 only, or even less, too low to actually induce industry to transition towards a greener economy. Moreover, the most potent support scheme is the carbon leakage list. What is the carbon leakage list? Well, it is a long list of industries that are supposed to be energy intensive and trade exposed, so subject to carbon leakage, and hence they are entitled to receive part of their allowances that they need for free, which is of course very nice. So with all these support schemes in place, what is the status of competitiveness of the European industry? Well, perhaps counterintuitively, the ETS has led to a significant increase in revenue and in fixed assets of industries covered by the EU ETS. It has not led to negative impacts on economic performance, which is to say that the policy instruments in support of industry were working their magic, which is fantastic as a legislator, because it clearly shows that you've been achieving what you were attempting to do. So who's then decarbonizing? Because we were saying earlier that the European Union is getting its act together and we see decarbonization happening. Well, here we see a graph showing what industry is doing and what combustion of fossil fuel is doing. Energy generation, for example. And we see that the energy sector is decarbonizing and that industry does not appear to be reducing absolute emissions. And that is a problem if you want to go to net zero, because industry has been, of course, producing more. Hence, they have been cleaning up, they have been becoming more efficient, but the absolute emissions have not been going down. So if we now want to attain net zero, we need to do substantially more. And that means that we need to try to phase out these IT support schemes that we have in place, because the European Union has introduced new, much more ambitious targets. The support schemes cannot continue as is, because that would mean that industry would get allowances to pollute for free, which they cannot have because they need to stop emitting. In a nutshell, so the transition is absolutely essential if we want to go to net zero. While at the same time, we of course would like to continue to produce and consume. So how do we square the circle? Well, for this, we have the carbon border adjustment mechanism that tries to prevent carbon leakage, because we don't help climate change if we stop producing in Europe and simply import products, goods from abroad that are produced with even more emissions than our domestic industry would be able to do. So this instrument would be capable, that's at least the policy hope, to put a price on imported products that is equivalent to their carbon costs, is equivalent to the domestic price in the European Union, and thereby incentivize transition within the European Union, but also offer incentives for foreign producers to become more mindful of carbon emissions. That is what we hope. And with this, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take you towards the CBAM design features. The CBAM design is complicated and is also unfolding at the moment, because we have two different types of periods. We have a transition period, which has already commenced, and we have a period when it should be fully in operation. We do not yet know all the details, all the legislation, but we already know the most important elements. The CBAM puts prices on embedded emissions of goods that are being imported into the European Union. That means we are looking at actual emission data or at default values if actual data is not available. It is importantly not addressed to countries, but to companies. The CBAM regulation tries to the extent possible to mirror the European emissions trading system. For example, when we look at prices that would later have to be paid. Importantly, the CBAM is an obligation on importers, so people established in the European Union trying to import products to Europe. It is not a tax and it is not a customs duty. It has an exclusive climate objective and has been designed to be compliant with WTO rules. Whether it is will probably be subject to legal challenges. I would not be surprised, but the European Commission has been trying feverishly to avoid exposure to WTO challenges. When will we know all the details? Well, what we have now is, of course, the CBAM regulation that is already out, but a lot of the detailed regulations will come at a later stage. So, as already indicated, we have a transitional period that was supposed to start in the beginning of 2023. It was then time shifted to October because the Commission was not yet ready, the software was not yet ready, the member states were obviously not ready because for this the Commission needs to be ready first. So it started in first on October 2023 with a data gathering and reporting requirement. Prices for CBAM allowances are not yet due. That will start with a definite period on 1st of January 2026, when there is a financial obligation actually taking effect. There will be 12 implementing acts, 4 delegated acts. What we have at the moment is basically the implementing regulation for the transition period. So a lot of the things we do not yet know. We do not yet know the entire scope of all the products that will fall under the CBAM regulation. We only have at this stage a number of energy intensive and trades exposed sectors, or specific goods rather, that fall within those sectors, belonging to iron and steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen. All the goods are listed in Annex 1 of the CBAM regulation based on their customs nomenclature codes. And it is envisaged that once the CBAM is fully phased in, it would extend to around 50% of greenhouse gas emissions under the EU ETS. So it would be a very sizable amount of industrial products that would be covered. The CBAM might be extended. We expect a report of the Commission in 2025 to this effect. And the Commission is also tasked during the definite period to examine if there are any circumvention attempts to reclassify products so to avoid the coverage of the CBAM regulation. So what type of emissions would be covered? Well, as is the case under the EU ETS directive, we also have here different kinds of gases, CO2, perfluorocarbons, and nitrous oxide is covered, direct and indirect emissions. In the transitional phase, we only have a reporting obligation. And as of 2026, Then, of course, the financial obligation is introduced. And importantly, we always try to be as close as possible to the EU ETS. And if there is a kickback or a cost reduction in any form whatsoever, we try to make sure that we are not treating entrepreneurs, producers abroad differently than our home industry. So, for example, for indirect emissions, if there is a support scheme for electricity prices, we would try to exclude that from CBAM obligations. In 2026 or before that, we might see an extension of the CBAM to transportation. What about the carbon price? Well, the carbon price is due as of 2026, and it is formulated in the spirit of mirroring the EU ETS and having the equal carbon price as we use within the EU ETS. So we have here a price of EUA emissions. Importers pay a carbon price corresponding to the European market price as well. Importantly, when we are introducing the CBAM, we are only able to do it as quickly as we phase out the support schemes to the IT industry. So here we have a list, a timeline of different years, and you see that the amount of free allowances are being phased out, and that is also the speed within which the CBAM will be successively introduced. So even though we start with our financial obligations in 2026, it's only fully operational in 2034. That is when prices in principle should be more or less equal to the domestic market prices of the EUA. In principle equal because the CBAM price is determined on the weekly average of the EUA prices. Importantly, and that is something that we cannot stress enough, the CBAM regulation is introduced and designed with the spirit of avoiding double pricing. So when there is an explicit carbon price paid in a third country, in a country outside the European Union, then this price can be deducted from the CBAM obligation. And that is, so to speak, also offering an incentive, a positive nudge, so to speak, for other countries to contemplate the introduction of a carbon pricing scheme by themselves. Here is a brief definition of a carbon price in a third country, and it's basically very broad, but only looking at a direct charge, direct price, be it in the form of a trading system, a tax, a levy or fee, does not matter, but it needs to be direct and effectively paid. Then we have obligations for importers during the transitional period. Well, we have the obligation to report by every quarter how much they were importing, what the emissions were, but verification is not yet necessary. However, there is already a penalty in place in case importers choose not to comply, and that is between 10 euros and 50 euros. So basically, they are under the duty to submit reports and make sure that they report their emissions accordingly. That changes as of 2026, because then the Commission will lay down the implementing rules and the precise calculation methods for embedded emissions in a new document. So now it is learning by doing. And then towards 2026, we know the final way how to calculate and how to properly assess the embedded emissions. And who is then supposed to deal with those rules? Well, basically, the goods can only be imported by into the EU by an authorized CBAM declarant. So you need to be certified that you are allowed to declare. Otherwise, you're not allowed to import. The yearly declaration of CBAM imports is done once a year, reflecting on all the emissions that or all the embedded emissions of goods that you were importing. And here the date would be the 31st of May. And on that date, you would also need to surrender allowances equal to the embedded emissions of the goods that you were imported. Of course, the Commission needs to review this because it's a public law measure. So when somebody does something, it needs to be reviewed. And when there are errors, there could be coercive measures in the form of penalties. Where do importers purchase allowances? Well, they do so at auction. Importantly, one CBAM certificate equals 1 ton of CO2. So basically, that is already what we know from the EUA system. The price is equivalent to allowances in the European Union. And interestingly, trading is not possible. So basically, you can purchase allowances, and if you don't need them, you can give them back to the European Commission and be reimbursed within certain rules. Importantly, you need to have an accredited verifier, and that might still be a point of practical implementation challenges, because it appears that there are not that many of these people around that would be capable or willing to verify embedded emissions. So that is a point of development. Now, when we take a look at how does this affect producers abroad, well, basically we have, of course, CBAM obligations that are in principle looking at EU importers, but EU importers need to make sure that they have the proper information from their producers. So there needs to be a much closer surveillance on the supply chain. A lot of interaction, a lot of questions, and particularly when things need to be verified after 2026, it will be, interesting to see how this works in practice. Let us now briefly take a look at the impacts on countries. We are dealing here with a trade measure that leads to a price increase for whatever is being imported into the European Union, like products here, that are falling within the scope of the CBAM regulation. And at first instance, we might take a look at who is actually importing what type of products into the European Union, and we see that some countries do that quite a lot. However, it does not really give us a full picture of how those countries would be affected, because if we take a look at the share of exports made up of CBAM goods for the respective countries, we see suddenly that countries like Bosnia-Herzegovina, Mozambique, or Serbia would be substantially affected, because Mozambique is exporting a lot of its aluminium to the European Union. So that is a sector that would be severely affected. What would be the overall impact? And for this, it is expedient not to look just at the export sectors, how those would be affected of different jurisdictions, different countries, but in particular, how does it affect the GDP of particular regions or countries? And here, interestingly enough, we see that while Africa would suffer, China would actually seem to benefit, according to the African Climate Foundation, for a CBAM at an allowance price around 40 euros per ton of CO2, provided, of course, that free allowances would be phased out. So that would be something after 2034. Here we see another list from the Task Force on Climate Development and the IMF, where we see the impact on welfare from a calculated baseline. And we see then that some jurisdictions are suffering quite a bit. For example, Russia, but also other trading partners, like, for example, India, would be losing out. And that, of course, is interesting, because some countries would want to embrace a carbon border adjustment in one form or another. They might want to move towards net zero in the future and might require similar instruments as well. So these are just examples from general equilibrium models that have been calculated on the basis of just one country introducing such measures and not several trading partners at the same time. What about the responses? And here it becomes interesting, because in principle, we would like to ensure that we are finding now countries that are exposed or at the receiving end of the CBAM. How would they want to react? And obviously, it's a non-trivial question. We've seen that the African continent is set to suffer quite substantially. And the elephant in the room is obviously common but differentiated responsibilities, because in principle, what the CBAM does is it incentivizes the introduction of carbon pricing in various jurisdictions, because only if you have a carbon price introduced, a direct carbon price, it can be deducted. Yet, under common but differentiated responsibilities, you're not obliged to do this. No, because the Paris Agreement is open as to the instruments that can be employed by various jurisdictions. So what are the options? Well, one option is the introduction of an explicit carbon price. It allows you to retain the money. Importantly, we have the choice between emissions trading on one side and taxation on the other. And since emissions trading requires a lot of data, verification, monitoring, reporting, it's probably not the first choice, but the introduction of carbon taxation is much easier, especially if introduced upstream, because it has then the additional benefit of not only addressing formal sectors, but at the same time informal sectors. Yet introducing such instruments might be complicated because of lack of administrative capacity. It will impact the domestic market. It will impact the competitive positions of the country, the industry. And whenever you introduce carbon pricing, there will be regressive effects, particularly when you look at embedded emissions regarding indirect emissions, energy generation. So you would need to have the administrative capacity, the volunteer and ability to address regressiveness and help out poor members of society. So explicit carbon pricing is all nice, but not very easy, no? Because like reality will kick in. Option 2 is convert existing taxation related to implicit prices towards explicit one. That is relatively easy. So if you already have an energy tax, for example, increase the carbon compound of this energy tax, and hence you are able to have an explicit carbon price. Vietnam is considering of following this approach. Relatively easy and beneficial under the CBAM. What about option 3? Here we have tax of exports related to carbon-intensive industries. And the question is it easily done? Well, whenever you export something, you can put a price, a charge for your carbon-intensive exports. You can do that. It becomes problematic if you're trying to do this goal-orientedly to CBAM countries like the European Union, because whatever measure you introduce, it should be WTO compliant. Option 4 is an export to non-CBAM states. How does that work? Well, basically, the idea is that if your product becomes very expensive in the European Union, you just ship your product to a different customer. So the products ending up in Europe would be the clean ones, while those with high embedded emissions would be moving to different parts of the world, used for different products that do not end up in the European Union. This is probably very likely to occur. However, that would not be very consistent with the overall objective of decarbonization, evidently. Point 5, that is also very likely to occur, is the introduction of an explicit tax plus compensating the taxpayers. How would this work? Well, basically, we would introduce a carbon tax on either industries that are exporting, so on our carbon-intensive export sectors. They would need to pay the tax. We get the tax back from the European Union because we are taxing increased carbon emissions, and find a different creative way of shifting the money back to them. So what we are looking in essence is a possibility to introduce a carbon price, while the money that the government reeks in is being given back in different types of subsidies and support schemes that are not directly affecting the carbon price. This is a very creative way and has the added benefit that the carbon price effectively is internalized, because carbon is costing and industry will take the increased carbon price into account and try to reduce emissions. It will set, however, the level playing field very differently, because polluting industries abroad would be compensated. So it would put the competitiveness of European industry at risk. However, I think that this is a solution that many countries will like to consider. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, the CBAM is coming, whether we like it or not. It is very contentious. No doubt, there are many countries that are not pleased, to say the least, about the CBAM proposal specifically, or carbon border adjustment in general. It is clearly an environmental measure needed to decarbonize the European industry, because without, things are not happening. It may, however, in practice, not offer sufficient protection to EU industries. Its true colors will show as carbon prices increase and as other industries try to find, other countries find ways to engage industries and recycle money back in different support schemes. And importantly, last but by no means least, the CBAM hits like a bombshell. It forces countries to actively think about carbon prices and how to react to the CBAM legislation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes.
Yes, so this was a great lecture on such a complicated topic, and you have introduced to us in a very accessible way. Thank you so much. There was a big applause for you from the audience, but I'm not sure whether you have heard that.
No.
I don't think so. Can you give an applause again? Thank you very much, Stefan.